In 1989, Buck Helm, a longshoreman from Weaverville, California, found himself traveling through Oakland on what seemed to be an otherwise ordinary evening. He was driving his compact car along the Cypress Street viaduct, a double-decker section of Interstate 880. At that time, the viaduct was a major artery for commuters carrying thousands of vehicles every day through the busy San Francisco Bay Area. Shortly after 5 p.m., a sudden and violent seismic event struck Northern California. The earthquake, later measured at a magnitude of 6.9, would soon be known as the Loma Prieta earthquake. The force of the quake was catastrophic. Across the Bay Area, roads split open, buildings collapsed, fires ignited, and entire sections of elevated highways were reduced to rubble. The Cypress Street Viaduct, which was built in the 1950s using outdated construction methods, suffered a devastating failure. Its upper deck pancaked onto the lower level, crushing vehicles and trapping dozens of motorists. Helm's vehicle was one of those trapped between the collapsed layers of concrete and steel. As the structure folded in on itself, he was caught in the wreckage with barely enough space to move. Emergency crews arrived on the scene and began rescue operations, but the scale of the destruction made progress painstakingly slow and dangerous. Tons of broken concrete and twisted rebar created a treacherous environment, with the risk of further collapse hampering efforts. For several days, workers picked through the ruins methodically, using cranes, jackhammers, and their bare hands when necessary. Search dogs were deployed to locate survivors, and thermal imaging devices were used to detect body heat under the wreckage. Still, the prospects of finding anyone alive diminished with each hour. Most rescues occur within the first 24 hours after the quake. Beyond that, survival rates dropped dramatically. On October 21st, nearly 4 full days after the earthquake, rescuers discovered signs of life deep within the wreckage. A California Department of Transportation engineer, while inspecting a section of the collapsed freeway, noticed slight movement inside a crushed vehicle. Rescue teams sprang into action, carefully cutting through the debris to reach the source. Inside a mangled blue compact car, they found Buck Helm alive. Despite being pinned in a confined space for approximately 90 hours, Helm was responsive. His survival was considered extraordinary given the conditions. He was immediately extracted and transported by ambulance to Kaiser Permanente Medical Center in Oakland. Upon arrival, medical staff found that he was severely dehydrated, suffering from crushed injuries and significant damage to his lungs, kidneys, and other organs resulting from the prolonged entrapment. Crush syndrome, a condition where prolonged compression of muscle tissue leads to the release of toxins into the bloodstream, was a primary concern. See, now when pressure is suddenly relieved after hours or days of entrapment, the trapped muscles release large quantities of potassium, lactic acid, and other toxic substances, and these toxins can cause severe kidney failure and systemic shock. Buck Helm's muscles had been compressed for nearly 4 days without adequate blood circulation, making his internal environment toxic the moment blood flow resumed. Doctors placed Helm in the intensive care unit, where he was given aggressive medical treatment. This included intravenous fluids to flush out toxins, mechanical ventilation to assist his breathing, and dialysis to support his failing kidneys. Initially, there was cautious optimism. News outlets reported on his survival as a beacon of hope amid the widespread devastation of the earthquake, and he quickly earned the name Lucky Buck in the media. However, the trauma that Helm had endured was profound and unforgiving. While initial stabilization was achieved, the damage inside his body was extensive. Prolonged hypoperfusion, the lack of oxygenated blood flow to critical tissues, had caused irreversible cellular damage in many organs. His muscles were worsening, his kidneys were struggling to clear the overwhelming flood of breakdown products, and his lungs, heavily contaminated by dust and debris from the collapse, were unable to properly exchange oxygen even with mechanical support. And because of all that, complications developed rapidly. Infections took hold, specifically pneumonia, as bacteria entered the bloodstream and lungs weakened by trauma. Sepsis, a life-threatening condition caused by the body's response to infection, led to further instability. His immune system, already compromised by the shock and physical trauma, was unable to mount an effective defense. Multi-organ failure followed. Helm's respiratory failure worsened as fluid accumulated in the lungs, preventing oxygen from reaching the bloodstream even with ventilatory support. His kidneys, taxed beyond repairs, ceased functioning. The heart, already burdened by electrolyte imbalances and toxic metabolites circulating through his blood, began to fail under the stress. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, including aggressive fluid resuscitation, antibiotic therapies, and continuous mechanical ventilation, his body's systems progressively shut down. Respiratory failure advanced to full cardiac failure as oxygen levels fell too low to sustain organ function. And on November 18, 1981, 28 days after his dramatic rescue, Buck Helm passed away in the hospital. The immediate cause of death was listed as respiratory failure secondary to multi-organ dysfunction caused by prolonged crush injury and systemic infection. Isan, a 3-year-old from Oldham, Greater Manchester, was playing inside his home alongside his brother Isan, who was 7, in the autumn of 2016. Their playtime was lively and familiar, with the room being scattered with toys of all sorts. Nothing out of the ordinary, until at some point during the morning, the atmosphere shifted. Family members nearby noticed that Isan had suddenly become distressed. What had been a moment of play turned into a scene of growing concern. Isan was no longer laughing or speaking. Instead, he appeared panicked, his breath strained. Recognizing immediately that something was wrong, the family sprang into action. Emergency services were contacted at once. The call was placed to the Northwest Ambulance Service, and within minutes, paramedics were dispatched to the home. While waiting, the family attempted to assist Isan themselves, but his condition continued to worsen. He was struggling to breathe and his level of consciousness began to falter. When the paramedics arrived, they immediately assessed the situation and began emergency intervention. The crew initiated life-saving measures aimed at restoring normal breathing. Given the signs of airway obstruction, the team employed various standard procedures to attempt to relieve the issue. Techniques such as back blows and abdominal thrusts were applied in rapid succession. Oxygen was administered to stabilize him, and suction equipment was prepared to assist in clearing any blockage. Despite their efforts at the scene, it became clear that Isan needed hospital care urgently. He was transported with high priority to Royal Oldham Hospital. During the journey, paramedics continued advanced resuscitation measures, fighting to maintain oxygen flow and cardiac activity. Upon arrival, the hospital's emergency team took over, deploying additional emergency equipment and techniques in a bid to stabilize the young boy. Doctors at the hospital worked relentlessly. Isan was placed under extensive care protocols with continuous monitoring and intervention. Imaging studies and direct visual examination soon revealed the source of the crisis. Lodged deep within his airway was a small object, a piece from a toy set, narrow and arrow-shaped, a Lego, leading to severe hypoxia. By the time Isan arrived at the hospital, the prolonged lack of oxygen had already triggered catastrophic systemic failure. With the airway completely blocked, his lungs were unable to oxygenate his blood, causing a rapid and dangerous drop in oxygen saturation. Within less than 2 minutes of obstruction, the brain would have begun experiencing acute hypoxia, leading to confusion, unconsciousness, and irreversible damage to brain cells. As hypoxia persisted, multiple organs began to fail. The heart, deprived of oxygen, struggled to maintain rhythm, eventually worsening into cardiac arrest. Blood pressure collapsed as the heart could no longer circulate blood effectively. Organs, such as the kidneys and liver, highly sensitive to oxygen loss, began suffering tissue death within minutes. The brain, lacking oxygen and blood supply, started to swell, a process known as cerebral edema, causing further pressure and irreversible injury. Brainstem function, responsible for automatic breathing and heart rate regulation, would have ceased shortly after unconsciousness set in. Despite aggressive interventions including advanced airway management, oxygen administration, chest compressions, and pharmaceutical attempts to restore cardiac activity, the prolonged hypoxic state made survival impossible. Isan's body had already passed the point of viable recovery by the time he reached definitive care. The official medical cause of death was recorded as asphyxiation. In the days that followed, an inquest was opened at Haywood's Coroner's Court to review the circumstances of the death. Witness statements from family members, paramedics, and hospital staff were taken. The Coroner's Court learned that during play with his brother, a small Lego piece had become involved, one that, due to its shape and size, presented a significant choking risk. The investigation confirmed that no party had acted negligently. The toys present in the home were typical for children's play, and supervision had been consistent with what would be expected in a household with young children. There was no prior indication that the Lego piece would cause danger during normal use, specifically among children of school age. However, Isan, being just 3 years old, was in an age group specifically vulnerable to incidents involving small objects. Inessa Polenko arrived in Abkhazia in the spring of 2024, part of a personal trip that blended leisure with pursuit of new experiences. At 39 years old, she had built a career as a beautification and had also become a recognized presence online, maintaining a growing following through her posts on travel, beauty, and lifestyle. Those who followed her were familiar with the polished photographs and scenic locations she frequently shared. Among the many sites in Abkhazia, the Gregory viewing platform is one of the most popular. Elevated hundreds of feet above the sea, it provides sweeping views of the shoreline, the distant horizon, and the cliffs dropping sharply into the water. Visitors come to stand at the railings, take photographs, and appreciate the natural beauty of the region. Protective barriers are in place at these sites, installed as a precaution to separate tourists from the unstable edges and sheer drops that characterize the cliffs. Polenko visited the Gregory viewpoint on a clear day, accompanied by a friend. Accounts from others present describe a relaxed atmosphere. Tourists move casually about the platform, some taking photos, others simply looking out over the sea. The barriers, although clearly marked, were occasionally crossed by visitors seeking a more dramatic angle for their photographs, a practice that authorities had previously discouraged, but which remained difficult to police fully. At some point during her time at the site, Polenko moved beyond the designated safety zone. She crossed past the protective railing and approached an area closer to the cliff's edge. Witnesses later recalled that she did so carefully, but the ground under her was uneven, composed of loose rocks and soil. These coastal cliffs, shaped by centuries of erosion and weathering, are often unstable, even when they appear solid from a distance. Polenko was seen preparing to capture a photograph. It was not uncommon for visitors at this location to want images showing the dramatic drop behind them or the expanse of the Black Sea stretching endlessly into the distance. She was holding her phone and setting her position when, without warning, her footing gave away. Observers described a sudden shift, a slip or stumble that left no time for recovery. The terrain, offering little stability, contributed to the loss of balance. In a matter of moments, Polenko went off the edge of the cliff. The drop from the viewing point to the rocky shoreline measured approximately 170 feet. Given the height, her fall would have reached an estimated speed of 60 to 75 miles per hour before impact. Witnesses described the fall as sudden and irreversible. Upon hitting the rocky shore below, Polenko suffered catastrophic injuries consistent with high-velocity blunt force trauma. These likely included multiple fractures to the skull, spine, ribs, and pelvis, as well as massive internal injuries to vital organs. Medical literature indicates that falls from this height onto hard surfaces often result in immediate or near immediate fatal disruption of the brain, heart, and major blood vessels. First responders would later confirm that she sustained injuries described as unsurvivable. Emergency services were contacted immediately by nearby witnesses. Local rescue teams responded to the call and made their way down to the base of the cliff, a task made difficult by the rugged terrain and lack of direct road access. Transporting medical equipment to the impact site required additional time and effort. Paramedics would eventually locate Polenko on the rocky shore and initiate emergency care procedures, including CPR and advanced trauma interventions. But despite rapid response and aggressive resuscitation attempts at the scene, her conditions were critical. She was transported to a nearby hospital for further treatment, but the extent of her injuries left medical teams without no viable options for recovery. Life-saving efforts were eventually ceased once it was determined that the trauma sustained was incompatible with survival. Following her death, local authorities launched a standard investigation to confirm the circumstances. It was later determined that the area where the incident occurred was properly marked with barriers and signage, and that Palenko had crossed into an unsafe zone of her own choice. Officials reiterated warnings to tourists about the dangers of moving beyond protected areas and natural landmarks, especially those involving cliffs where ground stability cannot be guaranteed. In May 2022, Deputy Robert Adam Howard was engaged in his normal law enforcement duties for the Harris County Sheriff's Office in Texas. At 27 years old, he had been with the department since 2019, serving specifically in the Violent Gain Suppression Unit. His assignment on that particular day involved the transportation of important evidence connected to an ongoing criminal case. Moving evidence between facilities or secured locations is considered a routine but critical task in the course of police work. Deputy Howard was operating a marked patrol vehicle along State Highway 249, a major roadway in northwest Harris County. The highway, known locally as Tombow Parkway, is a heavily trafficked route, specifically in the early afternoon hours when vehicles from commercial, personal, and law enforcement sectors are frequently on the move. Weather conditions that day were reported as clear and visibility was good. Now at approximately 2 p.m., while traveling northbound near the interchange with Spring Cypress Road, Deputy Howard's vehicle approached an area where an 18-wheeler was parked on the inside shoulder of the highway. The truck was stationary at the time, and that's according to later observations from investigators and eyewitness reports. For reasons that remain unclear, Deputy Howard's patrol unit began to veer slightly to the left. The motion was subtle at first, barely seeable to trailing drivers. There was no sign of sudden braking or evasive maneuvering. Within moments, however, the vehicle crossed onto the inside shoulder and collided at full speed with the rear of the stationary 18-wheeler, and the impact was devastating. The force of the crash drove the front of the patrol vehicle beneath the trailer of the 18-wheeler, creating a violent underride collision. Due to the height disparity between the two vehicles, the front of the patrol unit was crushed almost entirely, folded in on itself, and nearly split in half. The sheer violence of the impact destroyed the driver's compartment. Witnesses described the sound as an explosion, a sudden, sickening burst of twisting metal. Debris was ejected across multiple lanes, and the wreckage was so severe that parts of the vehicle, as coming from a patrol unit. First responders were dispatched immediately. Harris County Sheriff's deputies, fire crews, and paramedics arrived within minutes, but what they encountered was a horrifying scene of destruction. The patrol vehicle's front end had been obliterated, and Deputy Howard was trapped inside what could only be described as a mangled shell of steel and shattered glass. The damage was so extensive that emergency crews were forced to cut through twisted wreckage for an extended period of time just to reach him. Once extracted, Deputy Howard was rushed to Memorial Hermann Hospital in the Woodlands, a trauma center equipped for critical emergencies. Doctors initiated life-saving measures, trauma protocols, surgical evaluations, and intensive intervention. But despite their best efforts, his injuries were simply too catastrophic, and he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. A full investigation followed. Accident reconstruction specialists arrived on scene alongside Harris County investigators to begin determining how and why the crash had occurred. The entire section of the highway was cordoned off as investigators documented every detail of vehicle positions, debris patterns, roadway conditions, and any physical evidence that might shed light on the event. They noted the absence of skid marks, confirming that no braking or evasive attempt had been made, and the patrol unit had struck the truck at full highway speed, which is usually around 70 to 80 miles per hour. Investigators reviewed traffic camera footage, interviewed witnesses, and conducted mechanical inspections of the patrol vehicle. But no mechanical faults were identified. The vehicle's systems were intact and operational. Toxicology screenings found no evidence of drugs or alcohol, and there were no indications of distraction from external sources or forced maneuvers. Investigations were left with possibilities rather than answers: a momentary lapse in attention, extreme fatigue, or the onset of a medical emergency. Despite an investigation, no conclusive cause could be determined. The official findings remained open-ended, resting on theories rather than definitive explanations. If the police did find a conclusive cause, they never released it to the public, as I couldn't find anything else on this case. Following protocol, of formal procession was arranged to transport Deputy Howard's body from the hospital to the Montgomery County Forensic Services Center in Conroe. Funeral services were held several days later at the community of Faith Church in Hockley, Texas. Hundreds gathered, officers from across the state, family, friends, and those who had never met him but felt the loss. Deputy Robert Adam Howard left behind a wife and 2 young children.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.